Chapter 10. Pat watched the girl steadily with curious detachment. From all he had seen of her up until the present, she might have been composed of flint. The face she turned to the world was cold and unfeeling. He knew her trouble. Behind her, there was years of power and unquestioned authority, but only the force of her personality to shield her from the encroachments of designings of men, which had increased until she did not know to whom to trust. "I've only been in this country a week or so," he returned apologetically. "Maybe you wouldn't mind pointing out to me just where the Galileo Rim Rock lies." His inference was plain, and Marion stared at him, taken aback, but only for a moment. "You catch on fast, Mr. Stevens," she murmured. "But those boys, they know their way." She waved towards Ash Salmon and Whitten, working at the corrals. "No doubt they'll be able to direct you. Where there's a will, oh, you know." He could not help admiring her unyielding certainty, wrong as she was. "I never did ask Ash or Ollie their politics," he admitted. "But I can call them up here right now, ma'am. They'll be able to tell you quick enough that I hired them just yesterday." "No need for that," she retorted shortly. "Doubtless we should both expect them to say the right thing." Pat was unable to suppress a chuckle at her acuteness, however misdirected. "Well, reckon I'm just a depraved scoundrel plumb beyond redemption," he drawled slowly. "What else have I been up to, ma'am?" Resentment brightened her cheeks at what she chose to consider his insolence. "Who knows?" she exclaimed sharply. "I should expect you to know nothing of the burning of my High Springs Line cabin earlier this morning. You have been too busy, I assume." His glance fixed. "High Springs? Where's that?" All the sly drollery of his voice was gone. Marion uttered an ejection of impatience. She was beautiful in anger, her blue eyes betraying the ice and fire of her volatile nature. Gathering her reins, she prepared to whirl her pony away. Before she could do so, Chip Connor thrust out between Ezra and Sam at the door, striding out onto the porch. "Hold on, Marion," his curt words rang out. "What was that about the High Springs Line camp?" The girl delayed, her dangerous glance fastened upon him. "You should know," she threw back icily. "Probably not having counted on my finding you here this morning." "Tell what happened, will you?" he yelled her down hotly. "Very well. Hot smoke was seen on the peak of Sunrise," she snapped. "The glasses showed it to be the High Springs. Ed Mason rode out there at once and the cabin was burned." Connor heard her to the end with a hardened face. "So that's it. The Springs camp was fired, and since I was up there, I'm supposed to have done it. At Stephen's orders. Is that your idea?" Pat looked at the puncher swiftly with lifted brows. Though no more than a hired cowpunch, Chip Connor certainly knew this range thoroughly as she did. For once, it appeared, he was intent on speaking up to this girl. "And what would you suggest?" Marion demanded hotly. Connor's chest swelled. He seemed to be holding back some devastating blast with eyes flashing indignation, and abruptly he let go. "How is the first of my hearing you've ever asked anyone's opinion?" he burst out hoarsely. "And now you'll get it. I'll tell you who's been keeping up the dirty work, trying to make trouble and more trouble for Pat Stevens." He whirled to Pat. "Tell her the story I just brought you, Stevens." Arrested by his loud outburst, the girl shifted her eyes to Pat. "It bears on the matter at hand," the latter nodded quietly. "Are you sure you want to hear it, ma'am?" "Of course. I've never refused to listen, in spite of the slurs of my judgment," she exclaimed hotly. "And stop calling me ma'am. I run a ranch also, and if you need reminding, I'm as good a man as any of you." Pat smoothed the grin off his twitching jaws. "Yes, ma'am. I mean, Miss McLennan. You didn't happen to hear of the firing this morning, about the time your camp was going up in flames?"
"Gunfire, you mean? No, I did not. Should I have?"
Pat wordlessly pointed out the smashed window and the fresh marks of down-raking slugs visible on the walls of the ranch house. "We had visitors earlier this morning. Woke us up, in fact. Unfortunately, they stayed up there in the rocks," he pointed, "and we couldn't quite make out who they were." Concern shadowed the girl's pupils. Her tone was strangely quieter.
"You mean that some men shot up the ranch from there? They tried to kill you?"
He smiled. "Well, at the time, it didn't exactly seem like it was meant in fun."
"But who would have—"
she began, swiftly stopping. "Yesterday," Pat proceeded, unheeding, "I advised Connor to stay out of Dane Hardwick's way for a few days. Never mind why, though oddly enough it was your line camp that he picked for his ride." He paused. "Now, who do you suppose he ran into up there?" Marion shook her head, though she was beginning to think she could guess. "Chad Hanlon," Pat told her flatly. "Him and his man, Stack. They stayed at the camp, and Chip bogged down in the sagebrush to take watch, and the two cleared out before daybreak, and Connor trailed them down here straight to that ridge up there. It was Chip who broke up the shooting, or we might all be dodging bullets still." It was a matter-of-fact narrative of the bald events, yet the girl's face was white as he concluded.
"But Chad—"
she broke out. She stopped that, altering the direction of her thought.
"He and Stack left the spring cabins before daylight. It wasn't a fire then."
"That might have been an accident, and likely was." Pat was firm. "I don't doubt they tossed a few sticks on the fire when they got up and left it burning till they cleared out. Likely a chunk fell out afterwards and the logs caught. That can happen." She read the truth clearly enough. Pat's construction would have accounted for a delay in time, and it cleared the young puncher as well of any malicious vandalism. Little as she professed to know about Chip Connors, she had no wish to see him convicted of rowdiness in spite of work. But it was not of him that she was thinking now, her fine cut features drawn into lines of repulsion.
"There's no mistake?" she asked. "It was Chad Hanlon who made this attack on you?"
She had dismounted. She turned suddenly to young Connor, a new look on her face, strangely subdued and almost contrite.
"So that's why you attacked Chad!"
she exclaimed, shame dyeing her cheeks at the thought of the misconduct that she had placed on his act at the time. Chip met her look with a flinty opposition. Clearly he was of no mind to let her off the hook yet. "Yeah, and I'll tell you some more," he said. "You had your try at Hannon while he was here. Don't pretend to me you're not willing to see Stevens discouraged on the anvil as well." She gazed at him now, non-repulsed.
"I don't know what you mean,"
she said, but for the first time her eyes were evasive. "Oh, yes, you do. You pestered Hannon long enough to sell you the anvil. Have you asked Stevens yet, or are all these charges of burning and stampeding just another way of getting him tired of his bargain?" Something like confusion visited her under this relentless badgering and upsetting her cool aplomb. Watching them both closely, Pat was more interested in Marion's unprecedented meekness. He did not need to be told that Connor's reckless frankness was playing havoc with the girl's peace of mind.
"I'm afraid that you're drawing entirely egregious conclusions," she told Chip stiffly.
"And if it's a mistake that I think that you aim to ride roughshod over everyone you bang into, I'd sure be glad to hear it," he blurted out angrily. He knew he was going too far, but exasperation and desperation prodded him beyond endurance. For once, Chip had given way to the urge to speak his mind fully and without reserve before this girl, and now dull conviction told him he was sunk for good. "Connor," it was Pat, and his low tone was urgent. Chip glanced at him dully, and to his surprise, Stevens jabbed a thumb towards the door. "Inside," Pat muttered. The puncher started to voice a protest, one look at Pat's stern face, however, and he subsided. "Hang it all, Stevens!" It was all he could manage, mounting the steps without another glance at Marion, and disappeared through the door. It was Ezra, his bony jaws busy all this while with the ruminative chaw, who announced the discovery which Pat had made a few moments before. "Somebody's coming," the one-eyed giant grunted. All turned as a tall, loose-jointed figure came riding in without haste on the ranch trail. It was Sheriff Hardwick, his white mustache dividing his copper-hued face below the rim of his hat and concealing the set of his iron jaws. "Well, Hardwick," Pat greeted as the lawman drew rein, with a raking scrutiny for everyone present. "What is it now? Something to do with those horses, I expect." Dane jerked his head in a brief negative. "Not this time. I'm looking for Chip Connor," he announced colorlessly. "Understood I could locate him here." Marion's glance ran quickly to Pat. There was surprise and swift reprisal in her steady regard. Recalling something he had said, she suddenly understood his true reasoning for ordering Connor into the house, and it made her feel smaller than ever. "No holes in that," Pat was assuring the sheriff quietly. He caused more than one head to lift as he went on. "Connor's been on the books as my foreman since I took over, Sheriff. What's your interest in him?" With methodical slowness, Dane extracted a paper from his pocket and turned it over deliberately. Pat saw that it was a warrant form. "It's a charge for assault, sworn to by Chad Hanlon," said the sheriff. "What? You mean this is Hannon's brave way of taking a trouncing and you're backing him up?" There was frank disapproval here. Marion stepped forward with a determined expression. "Might I have a word about that fight, Mr. Hardwick?" Dane displayed a shade of annoyance. Knowing her of old, he was not disposed to match wits with her now. "Well, this is Connor's second row in less than a week. I ain't interested in the cause. He's wanted for questioning in the manner of them horses as well." "Maybe I can help you out, Hardwick," Sam offered this juncture. "What is it you want to know?" Dane examined him dispassionately. "Keep your shirt on, Salone. I ain't got to you yet." Sam would have made a peppery rejoinder, but Pat motioned him to silence. "It's too bad, Sheriff," he spoke up clearly. "Fact is, Connor's not around just now." Hardwick accepted this as flagrantly as he had taken anything else they had to offer. "I'll take a look around." Pat shrugged. He stepped aside as the lawman mounted the steps and entered the house, and Dane was gone for quite a while. They heard him moving around about inside, and he was alone when he reappeared. "I'll see that Chip gets in touch with you, Sheriff." Pat cut off the man's questions before they could start. "Of course, we don't know this would turn up, and he came to you before on his own accord. Don't you forget that. That ought to be in his favor." Hardwick answered with a grunt, and he nosed around the barn briefly, came in back, and favored Pat with an unwinking glaze. "Don't know if I savvy you, Stevens. You better be on the level." Pat's nod was short. He didn't allow himself to be prodded into a retort, watching Hardwick step into the saddle and turn away, jogging out of the yard as methodically as he had come. "Reckon he's no friend of ours," Sam countered promptly. "He's got his troubles," Pat shrugged. "I've made friends with harder men. Just takes time, was all." Marion spoke up at last, her manner unwontedly amiable. All of her attention was fixed on this tall man, who she understood no better than Hardwick did, but whom, against her will, she found herself beginning to like. "The sheriff came to you, bringing Chad Hannon's childish complaint, Mr. Stevens,"
And you made no mention whatsoever of your own injustices at his hands?" she asked wonderingly.
Pat waved this away. He wouldn't understand.
"Hardwick? But he's a duly convicted law enforcement officer."
She was frankly bewildered by his attitude.
"Chad has not only flaunted the law, he's turned a gun against you. Surely you intend to do something?"
"Yes, I do," he allowed dryly. "I'll take steps when the time comes." Marion, of all persons on this range, could have been best fitted to appreciate his point of view. She had never had any use for a man who couldn't skin his own skunks, but for months she had been obscurely daunted by Chad Hanlon, whose cool effrontery somehow brought all of the worst in her.
"You can't mean you'll wait till he repeats his treacherous cowardly attack?" she exclaimed.
"Put it this way," Pat countered patiently. "You made some mention yourself of stampeded steers and the like. Have you turned that over to Hardwick yet, or does that come next?"
"But that's an entirely different matter."
"How different was it when Ace Kangle was picking up for murder in El Castro?" He thrust in expectantly.
"There's been no intention of passing that on," she retorted warmly. "Sheriff Hardwick is working on that case."
"You mean by carrying around this damn fool warrant sworn by Chad Hanlon?" It was a telling thrust. Marion shook her auburn head in irritation, her brows knit.
"It does seem strange, but according to Uncle Henry," she began.
"Who's he?" She looked at him in surprise.
"Henry McLennan, my uncle, who has interests in the copper mines at Bonanza Belt. You must have heard of him."
"Oh, it's him that owns the HM."
"Of course, you didn't think it was mine," she laughed ruefully. "I manage the ranch because I lived there since I was a child, and Uncle Henry's affairs keep him pretty close to the mines."
She sobered then.
"He came down, though, when we learned that Ace had been killed. He swears that he'll find out who was doing the killing, and he's given Mr. Hardwick to understand that he must be doing something. You were in town when it happened, weren't you?" she broke off.
Pat nodded. "Hardwick already had his whack at me. I wasn't able to tell him anything."
"What do you think happened, Mr. Stevens?"
"Well, I wouldn't be in a position to know. And the name's Pat, by the way," he said solemnly.
"You don't think that there could be anything to this story about Chip having a fight with Ace?" she persisted. "Certainly not, if you've made him your foreman."
"They fought," he nodded. "I saw it. Chip, he took his beating without a whimper. If you mean, did it go any further than that, Marion, you can just forget it."
"There's something else I want to ask you."
Her clear eyes were both veiled and searching.
"Have you really bought the anvil, Pat? Is it true? Or did you simply lease the range subject to Chad Hanlon's approval?"
His amazement at the question could not have failed to impress her. "Let me get this straight." He was cold and insistent. "Is that what Hanlon claims? He told you that when he showed you the ranch deed to prove that he hadn't sold out?" The assent in her startled glance was answer enough, nor was Pat's aloft demeanor lost on her. "And which of us do you believe, him or me?" She went scarlet. A stinging retort hovered on her compressed lips. Before it could issue, she wheeled away from him, and throwing herself on her pony, whipped it into motion with a cut of her quirt. Pat watched her departure without any attempt to call her back, but his disapproval was by no means as strong as it appeared. A gleam of admiration crept into his eyes as the girl went flying up the trail. Ezra and Sam watched this stormy leave-taking as well. They had drifted down to the corrals a minute ago, leaving the pair to themselves, but had stolen many a wary glance that way as the conversation between Pat and Marion McLennan stretched out. Both partners professed to understand what was protending. "Reckon he's fallen for that girl like a ton of bricks," Ezra muttered, scrutinizing Pat guardedly. The dang hat! The dang nitwit! Well, he's a sucker for spitfires, Sam concluded anxiously. Ain't much doubt that Marion fits that bill, neither. Well, we can all hope they get mad in the end and claw each other's heads off, grumbled Ezra. It's a crying wonder it ain't happened already. But as they turned back to their work to avoid drawing Stephen's attention to their low-voiced conversation, there was little doubt in the worried minds of the two that a romance was brewing. All their stinging humiliation at Pat's hands the day before was promptly forgotten. Unwearied, the two scarred old warriors sprang mentally to his aid in the hour of his gravest danger. End of chapter 10.